In a world obsessed with rankings, two men dare to chisel greatness out of metaphorical granite, one wildly subjective opinion at a time. This show, every episode, we select four icons from a single topic and immortalize them in our own personal halls of fame. Subjective? Absolutely. Debatable? Always. Set in stone? Until next week, welcome to the Mount Rushmore show, where your top four says everything about you. I'm Mike Mintz. He's Joe Mintz. Last week, we talked a little bit about Adam Sandler and his best films. Then some big time, I guess you would say, some big news occurred. Some big time celebrity deaths. We had Malcolm Jamal Warner, famous from the Cosby Show, passed away. Heavy metal pioneer Ozzy Osbourne died, and these things usually come in threes. Joe.
Yeah, the third one being the late great Hulk Hogan, who passed away at 71. So this week we're stepping into the squared circle to honor a man who I would say is larger than life persona, transcended wrestling. Um, Hulk Hogan, love him or hate him, we'd argue he's a controversial figure. The Hulkster was wrestling for an entire generation. And with the recent news of his passing, we thought no better time to carve out the Mount Rushmore of professional wrestlers.
This is new territory for us, Joe. We've definitely talked some sports. We've definitely talked lots of movies.
Sports accounts. It's sports and entertainment. Let's be honest.
And that's a fair point. And it's interesting. We'll get into it a little bit about our backgrounds, but well, I guess maybe this would be a good time. So, like when I first started watching professional wrestling, was I remember the first time I ever saw it was Saturday Night's Main Event in the late '80s, and this was a time period where wrestling not being legitimate, the outcomes being determined was already an open secret. It wasn't something that is like now with the Netflix series on Unreal where you're literally seeing behind the scenes. But as a kid, you didn't know that. As a kid watching that, even with the adults, there was this element of I wouldn't say authenticity, but entertainment aspect to what they were doing. The other thing I wanted to bring up about that is the fact is, like you said, it is sports. These guys are not, these aren't fake falling down or anything. These are all really doing these things. The outcomes are just predetermined.
Yeah, if you tell any professional wrestler that it's fake, you might get slapped in the face for real because it's a big insult on the things they put through their body. Yeah, they're really suffering pain and aches. I mean, Hulk Hogan's a great example of someone who's had countless surgeries. Wrestlers
Mm-hmm.
don't live a long time, oftentimes. 71 for Hulk Hogan, many would argue, outkicked his coverage for the amount of things he's put his body through, both on the mat and off the mat with his lifestyle. And yes, there is predetermined outcomes, and you could argue it's more theatrical than it is fake. But the pain they go through, the things you see, they do it for us. They know it's going to happen, but they really feel it.
Yeah, they do, and we're gonna. I guess we'll jump in just a minute, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that um, when it comes to my experience in pro wrestling and those early days in the 1980s, Hulk Hogan was the man. Like the take your vitamins, drink your milk. Hulkamania ran wild, and as a kid, you couldn't ignore that. I mean, there were other big stars too, but he was the dude. Fast forward a couple years, I actually did not watch wrestling for quite a bit of time until the Attitude Era in the late '90s comes about, and that was a cultural phenomenon. You couldn't avoid it. You couldn't escape it, and it competed with things like Monday Night Football, which is wild to say, but it certainly did. And WCW and the NWO of the time, all of those things that were also important. So I got back into wrestling. I was in my late teenage years there, right into heading into college, and so there's some huge stars that come out of there: The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, these guys, these names as well. And this cultural shift in wrestling from the golden era of the '80s, the '70s, and the '80s into what the late '90s becomes, and that's what kind of. So my experience in wrestling is varied on those two eras specifically. Everything after the Attitude Era, I'm aware of, but it's not like something that I was a big fan of. So I don't know if I aged out or just life changed or whatever. So Joe, I'm kind of curious about what your experience is with wrestling.
It's awesome that you grew up in the Attitude Era because many
Oh
would
yeah.
still argue that it was the best era of wrestling. And
It's
you had a
fair.
lot going on. Like you said, they competed Monday Night Football, WCW, Monday Night Nitro, and the NWA rise. Wrestling was arguably at its peak in the 90s. But I came out a little bit later. I'm a little bit younger than you. My first ever experience was my dad had Friday Night SmackDown on, and I remember Rikishi,
Oh yeah.
the big Samoan. And at the time, as a kid, I thought it was completely real. I'm like, this is nuts. This is wild. And as I got older, say closer to teenage years, not quite there, I watched every Monday Night Raw, every Friday Night SmackDown, every Tuesday ECW. I
Oh yeah.
recorded it at the time, but I didn't watch it live because it was long and it went on too late. And I wouldn't say I didn't know it was fake, but I maybe didn't want to believe it. Like you thought elements were real. That's kind of the beauty of it. Like, yeah, I know it's determined, but I feel like they don't like each other. Or I feel like that move was rogue. Like you kind of had this belief, like you want to believe it was real so bad that you kind of were suspended in it when you watched it. And I grew up with the likes of John Cena being one
Hmm.
of my heroes, and Batista was the big SmackDown guy.
Oh
And you
yeah.
had the heels like Edge and Chris Jericho and Christian. Those were kind of the folks I grew up on. And some of them still very relevant today, even in the Attitude Era guys. But I like to touch on kind of the evolution of wrestling. I've been fascinated by wrestling for many years now. In fact, I read an amazing biography about Vince McMahon
Oh
called
yeah.
Ringmaster. It was a big bestseller, not written by Vince, but written by a journalist who investigated all about wrestling and Vince McMahon and the change and adaptation of wrestling. But it started out very different. It was all territorial. It was
Hmm.
all regional. So you had promotions that dominated the US. Each territory had their own heroes, and wrestling was more of a local affair. In fact, it was even hard to find on television. Like if there was the Southeast Territory and the Northeast Territory, you couldn't see them on your local stations. So you only knew what was going on around your neck of the woods. And then Vince McMahon, specifically Vince Sr., his father, ran the Northeast.
Hmm.
But Vince Jr., when he came on board, he had much bigger dreams, and he nationalized the WWF and then brought in stars from everywhere and made it a TV spectacle. And very controversial at the time because it was a bit of an old boys club and agreement, these territories. So when he went national and was buying out stars from other territories, he ruffled a lot of feathers. Then came the Monday Night Wars, WCW versus WWF, the Attitude Era, NWO, DX, Monday Night Raw versus Nitro. This was peak mayhem. And today, it's a multi-billion-dollar sports entertainment company traded on the stock market. NXT, AEW, and international fans all redefine what wrestling looks like now. And culturally, like I said this earlier, but the kayfabe of it all. And kayfabe is a hard word to define, but I define it as, is it real or is it fake? The magic of wrestling always lived in those blurred lines of reality and fiction. We knew it wasn't real, but it was real enough to believe. There's a great clip that went around the internet of an older gentleman going, "Well, it's real to me," and that's how I felt about my relationship with wrestling. Wrestlers, there were heroes or villains, everything in between. They were soap opera stars for people who hated soap operas, which was me. Growing up with a mom that watched a lot of General Hospital, and I had to go the other way. And then last thing I want to touch on before we get into our picks is this new Netflix show just dropped this week. It's 5 episodes. It's called WWE Unreal. It takes that algorithm like the F1 Drive to Survive and Full Swing type series. If you haven't seen it yet, it's a wild ride. It pulls back the curtain on everything the business has tried to keep hidden, from booking decisions, backroom politics, the toll it takes on performers. It makes you realize just how orchestrated yet dangerous the whole spectacle has always been. And For anyone that grew up in any sort of relationship with wrestling, this is a must watch. Whether or not you watch it today or not doesn't matter. This is a fascinating documentation of a sport that's been in everyone's lives at some point.
No, I agree. I'm 2 episodes into it, and I'm just blown away by how compelling it really is. And you would think, I know there's probably some people that are going, but doesn't it ruin it? And I'll be honest, man. And I've read quite a few books on wrestling because it's one of those things that interests me. Back in the 30s or 40s, I think it was the 1940s, this guy wrote a book called The Barnums of Bounce, which was running down the pro wrestling scene of the time. And even then, people were very much aware that this whole thing was orchestrated, that the outcomes were predetermined. It was a secret that was not much of a secret. So fast forward even into the 80s and the 90s, people know this is not something that anybody was really keeping a solid lid on, because how could you? You bring up, we got a couple of terms, Joe, that we got to get through here. Kayfabe is one of those, and if you've never heard that term before, it is. I think you did a good job of kind of describing it. It's that pig Latin version of fake, right? You put the syllables on the ake instead of that, you get kayfabe. And essentially, what it means is the idea that you're playing part of the you're playing that character all of the time. A good example is if you've seen the Unreal. There's a scene Cody Rhodes after getting a pile driver. The next time he's with some fans and he's wearing a neck brace, right? Does he really need a neck brace? No, but that's the kayfabe. He's keeping that character going. There was a famous time in the 80s when I believe it was the Iron Sheik and Jim Duggan, who was the big USA guy with the 2x4, were caught in the same rental car together. They shouldn't have been that because they were complete enemies of the time, right? So they were breaking that kayfabe. So that's our term, one of those. The other ones we're going to use today are going to be heel. That's the bad guy, okay? And then face or baby face, those are the good guys. And I do want to point out, there's an important distinction sometimes. And I saw this was there was an NXT kind of behind the scenes deal where they were talking, and a guy was explaining the difference between a heel and a face. And he said most people think the baby face is the good guy and the heel is the bad guy. He says that's an oversimplification. It's much easier to think about the baby face is giving the audience what they want, whereas the heel is denying the audience what they want. That is the trick to it. So we're gonna have I definitely got both heels and faces on my list. So if we use those terms or kayfabe, just understand what we're talking about, Joe.
One more thing I want to add to that is how the business has changed, and I think why this series is good timing. The sport now is leaning into, yes, it's orchestrated. People will go in interviews and even say it. If you ask The Rock, he's not denying any of these things. Whereas in the past, in the early Vince McMahon era, you had to deny it. The Undertaker was the dead man everywhere. But
Right.
now, with the growth of individual wrestler personalities and social media and movies, they have to be able to separate the two to build their brand. Whereas The Undertaker, credit to him, he sacrificed a lot of dollars to stay true to that kayfabe as the dead man. And not until now is he going public about his actual personality. And he even admits, when you do it for this long, you kind of forget who you really are because you're in character all the time. You can never be public without it. That was Vince McMahon's style. You saw late night shows. I remember Andy Kaufman getting
Oh yeah.
slapped by Jerry the King Lawler. We all thought it was real. No one, okay, wrestling's fake, but that was real. And that's part of the magic of that era that's now changed and evolved, but hasn't sacrificed people's enjoyment and viewment of the entertainment sport.
Absolutely. Joe, should we dig in? Should we get started here?
So,
All right. Well, I think that I'm going to mix up my list a little bit. I was going to go later with this guy, but I think some of the things you said earlier, this plays in pretty well. So I'm going to put on my number one here. My first pick is going to be Ric Flair. And the reason I'm going with Flair is, first of all, like Hogan, Flair has a complicated legacy. Hogan certainly, and I know there's been a lot of stuff that's come out, before his death, but certainly after his death, where some of the things that he said and all of those things, it's hard to take away what he's done really well. But Flair has also kind of got this complicated legacy in some respects, and some people really hate Flair. And to that point, I'm going to say that's the point. Ric Flair was an excellent heel, he was very good at making you very angry while you were watching him. But I wanted to bring up the thing that people probably miss about Ric Flair is those early days of wrestling. You brought up the territories. The NWA was this idea, this National Wrestling Alliance, where they collected these territories together and they would unify one champion throughout the territories. And then that champion would then go to each individual territory and put on, the show. And then the belt would be this one belt. It was kind of the precursor to the larger WWF at the time, whereas the WWF were all under one umbrella. These were individual territories that were kind of a handshake agreement that they were going to allow this to happen. Flair is the man during these territory days in the NWA, and he's going around to the different territories, and he's the huge star. But the deal is, the trick of it all is that Flair would wrestle whoever was the big guy in each of these territories, and he would make them look amazing. He would put on such a show that if you were there and you wanted to see your guy do a great job, Flair would make them look great. And then here's the catch. Flair would then win the match, usually through some sort of trickery or some sort of underhandedness, which would be very upsetting to the crowd. But here's the thing. Not that Flair kept the title, he kept winning, which made people want to see him lose, but he also made the local guy, the territory guy, look just incredible. And the bottom line for Flair, what puts him on my Mount Rushmore, is the fact that he could do it with anybody. You didn't have to be a skilled wrestler wrestling against Flair. You didn't have to be a Harley Race or somebody that could actually do it in the ring. Flair was going to carry you no matter who you were at the time. Sure, he probably overstayed his welcome and all of those things, but there was a time where Ric Flair was the absolute greatest, and he kept a pretty good career through most of it.
Yeah, Mike, great pick. And I don't think you can have a wrestling Mount Rushmore without this man. He's on mine as well.
Oh, good.
My relationship to him growing up, being a wrestling fan, is he was the old guy. And it was a bit like, who is this old guy that obviously had a history, but he's like 80 out there rolling around with these guys. It was like I could fast forward through that part of the DVR. It wasn't until I watched his 30 for 30, which showed his career, but also looked at him as more of a tragic figure in many ways, that I learned about how the sport wouldn't be what it is without Ric Flair and the mic skills of a guy that no one had. I look at him and that rivalry he had with Dusty Rhodes, probably redefined wrestling at the time. Probably the longest career of any wrestler consistently. There's guys that have made appearances after retiring, but he went 1972 to 2012 without a break. Many know him as the Nature Boy. His signature move being the figure four leg lock and the famous. I won't do it justice. Can you give us a woo, Mike?
Woo! That's my best. I'm sorry. It's hard
good.
without the crowd.
I can't do it. But why he's on the Rushmore is he embodied wrestling swagger before anybody. He made being the bad guy look good, to your point earlier, and also making every opponent look like gold. He wrestled in practically every major promotion and held more titles than luggage at the airport. Just some career highlights for him: 16-time world champion, officially, though some counted 21 back in those days. It was kind of hairy. NWA and WCW legend. Icons, the territories, and the Four Horsemen faction, if you remember, going back to the 70s on that one. And 1992 was a peak Royal Rumble winner. He won the WWF title in what many call the greatest Rumble ever. And he had an awesome retirement match. That was my relationship with him, was the last match against Shawn Michaels in 2008 in WrestleMania. And I remember that it was like you wanted to cry. It was, "I'm sorry, I love you," is what Shawn Michaels said before he gave his final kick to Ric Flair, as he's emotional in the ring. And that's where the kind of kayfabe goes away. It still gives me goosebumps thinking about it.
Yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, it's one of those iconic moments, Joe.
Some fun facts I found about Flair is he survived a plane crash in 1975 that broke his back and almost ended his career before it began. In fact, if you see before plane crash pictures, he was a very big dude, very heavy. he was wrestling and didn't have the Nature Boy tagline, didn't look the same. After that, it redefined his look, his mindset of wrestling. That's when he became the Nature Boy. He lived the gimmick. I think limousines, Rolexes, custom robes. He was a jet flying, kiss stealing man of real life. I think he lost himself in the character in many ways, which made living hard as you get a little bit older doing that. And he's also the father of a WWE superstar, Charlotte Flair, who's one of the greatest women wrestlers of all time as well. And I would say his saying of woo, I'll just say it quietly, became a cultural phenomenon. It's used in everything from NFL games to hip hop lyrics, and he's become more relevant, arguably, today than in the peak of his career.
Agreed. And yeah, it's a cultural touchstone. You can say, give me a Ric Flair, and somebody will shout woo at you. And it's, yeah, like you said, it's permeated through all parts of sports entertainment. So Ric Flair is definitely on the list. I guess, Joe, I'll go on to my number two then, since we both are sharing Flair.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pick somebody. This is my wild card one. I always try to put in one of these that are very meaningful, probably to me and maybe even me only, that don't fit on anybody else's list. This guy probably is on quite a few people's list, but he certainly makes mine, and that's Mick Foley. You might know him better as Mankind or Dude Love or
Man,
even Cactus Jack. He had quite a few different.
poor guy. He's still walking?
He might not be, but I'll tell you what, if you know anything about Mick Foley, and I've read his book that he wrote himself, um, have a Nice Day, by the way, is the title of it. And if you understand Mick Foley's mindset, that was what he wanted to do, was be not necessarily that risk taker, but to do something that seemed unbelievable when you were watching it, to put his body in harm's way in a way that it looked like a car crash on television, is the best way I can describe it. And there were times I was legitimately concerned for Mick's health. And reading his book, you get the understanding that that was the emotion he was trying to get out of people. You talked about ECW. ECW doesn't exist without the ideas of Mick Foley, without Cactus Jack, without that extreme version of wrestling, like pushing things to a limit where you go, when you say, is this an illusion or is this real? He really blurred those lines when it comes to wrestling, and he pushed things those far. So there were these, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, he took bodily risks. He jumped off the Hell in the Cell. He jumped off cages. He did all sorts of things. Took 11 headshots from a chair while his hands were handcuffed behind his back. He did things that you shouldn't do. And like you said, is he walking today? I don't know. He might be in a wheelchair. If he's certainly not wrestling. Let's put it that way. He put
Yeah.
his body in those types of positions. But the one thing I wanted to, before I wrap up here on Mick Foley, is you brought up the mic skills, the promo abilities. For a great wrestler, you can't just have it in the ring. And you could argue Mick Foley's wrestling technical abilities all day long, but he was entertaining in the ring nonetheless. The other thing he was entertaining was when he was on the microphone. He could deliver a promo with humor, with anger, with all of these different emotions tied up into them. And it was always entertaining to watch him do anything. If he's on the mic only or if he's in the ring, but you combine those two together and you get a great wrestler. And that what puts him on my Mount Rushmore.
Yeah. Yeah. When I cringe a little bit because the things he put his body through, man. I mean, for our entertainment, I'm glad you added him to the list. He should be on someone's just for what he's done for the sport. I mean, talk about extreme championship wrestling. That was the dark side of wrestling. Guys jumping in nails, tables, ladders. It wasn't about the Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels beautiful top rope skill and art of wrestling. These were guys that weren't very athletic, but were willing to put their body on the line day in, day out for our entertainment. And he embodied that. And that's how I thought of him is he wasn't built like Lex Luger or the Ultimate Warrior, and he had to compensate, right? And how do you compensate in a sport like this? Is you do the things others won't, and you say the things that they can't. And he did both of those things better than anybody.
Yeah, and I think you don't even have an ECW. And here's the thing about Mick Foley is like, yeah, it is kind of one of those moments where you're like, I don't know if I want to watch his match because he might do something really harmful to his own body. But the thing is I always felt that Mick Foley did it as a mainstream level. Like ECW was too harsh for some viewers, where Mick Foley kind of bridged that gap on the mainstream level. He could do just enough to push the envelope, but it wasn't too much where people were tuning out, or at least I don't think so. All right, Joe, I think you finally have a different one than me. So,
I do. I'm going to pick one of the guys from your era, Mike, and that is Stone Cold Steve Austin.
oh, one of the best.
Not the longest career of any wrestler. He went from 89 to 2003, although he's had some post-retirement appearances here and there. The Texas Rattlesnake was another nickname he had, known for the Stone Cold Stunner. And I love that catchphrase. Austin 316 says, I just whooped your ass. Give me a hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Shattering in the beers. It was beautiful. And why is on my Rushmore? I mean, he's got to be up there just for selling merch alone at the time. But he saved WWE during the Monday Night Wars with WCW. His anti-hero character flipped the script on good guys and bad guys, and his feud with Vince McMahon was appointment television. It was the first time you saw Vince McMahon in the ring as a wrestler and as a character, Vince McMahon. And you saw a guy beating up and yelling at his boss. And people resonated with that. Like the things they wish they could have done to their boss they didn't like but couldn't. And Stone Cold embodied that. Because the character of Stone Cold originally was supposed to be a heel. The Austin 316 whooped your ass was supposed to make fans booed, but they got the opposite reaction, and it worked. And that's what defined the Attitude Era to me. I remember his career highlights with King of the Ring. That's when he first dropped the Austin 316 promo, and when the legend was born. And then he carried the Attitude Era into the late 90s. And then he won the WWE Championship 6 times as well. Funny story about his name. It was his then wife's suggestion. Drink your tea before it gets stone cold. That's the line that got him. And he was originally known as the Ringmaster under Ted DiBiase's management before he became that character. And another guy put his body on the line. He broke his neck in a botched pile driver from Owen Hart in 1997, shortening his career. In fact, the pile driver has since been banned from WWE. And he holds the record for most Royal Rumble wins with 3.
Stone Cold is a guy that absolutely deserves to be on a consensus greatest pro wrestlers list. And for the reasons you mentioned, and I really just wanted to touch on a couple of, obviously I watched a lot of Stone Cold. He was the guy at the time that was really the driving force behind pro wrestling and really defined that Attitude Era. The interesting thing about him, like we were talking in the beginning, that ideas of heels and faces, and where this guy is supposed to be the bad guy. What does that mean? Well, Stone Cold was doing things that the bad guys in wrestling were doing. He was cheating. He was hitting people with steel chairs. He was doing the things that a typical heel would do, but he was giving the audience what they wanted. And so they were absolutely enamored with this guy. So he's a true anti-hero. He's doing the bad things, but you can't help but cheer for him because he's doing it to the people you don't like. The Mr. McMahon character comes out. Of course, Vince he owned the company, but he was a color commentator and secretly owning the company, of course, never admitting to that fact. When the Stone Cold thing comes out, especially after the Montreal screw job in the late 90s, and everybody dislikes Vince McMahon, you have a character that is also anti-establishment, and it's a perfect storm where Stone Cold can beat up his boss. And I like how you brought up the fact that it becomes this, people start to really identify with that, which really says a lot about where we are as a society, where you're like, oh yeah, get your boss, man. We all want to do that. So
we had this 90s pent-up anger, which embodied the Attitude Era at the time. Just at the time of our culture more than just the time of wrestling alone.
I love that you put Stone Cold on there. I'm going to also pick an Attitude Era guy who's still sticking around, and that's The Rock. You guys might know him better as Dwayne Johnson. And the thing about The Rock is he was the best of the best during what I argue is the best era of wrestling. He had pretty good ring skills, but beyond the things he could do in the ring, he changed the game with his ability to speak on the microphone, with his ability to talk in a way that was just electrifying. And it's hard because I still watch him. He just came out on the Unreal, and he was talking to the crowd, and they sing the whole sing along with The Rock. Like Rudy Poo, Candy Ass, all of the things that he would say. People, everything he said became a catchphrase, and people would say it with him, and you couldn't help but get caught up in those moments. He transcended wrestling. He's now a major A-list movie star, which I don't think even at the time, we all kind of people were watching going, this guy's bigger than this, which became a problem for Vince, Mr. McMahon, and even probably the structure of pro wrestling, WWE especially, is now nobody can be The Rock. Nobody can be bigger than the WWE because The Rock absolutely was, and possibly still is. He transcended wrestling into a career that's outside of that. But I have to say, from an all out, want to see a segment with a guy. If you were to tell me I only get one more pro wrestling segment and it's not a match, I'd want to see The Rock.
Man, this was the hardest part of my list was The Rock, will he or won't he make it? And I did carve out a section for honorable mention, but he wasn't on my list, but it was really, really hard. And if there was a Mount Rushmore of mic skills, unquestionably he would be on it. And not a bad resume either. But to your point earlier, I think it was that his career highlights are so beyond wrestling. When you think of The Rock, you don't immediately think of wrestling. I mean, he's a global box office star. He's a tequila mogul. He owns face skincare companies, energy drink companies, and now he occasionally returns to the ring. But he is the chairman of the board of this public company now. In fact, his nickname has become the final boss.
Right.
So he still has major influence. But the reason he didn't make my list is because when he was a true wrestler, it was a short time and it was an impactful time. But he didn't have the. I'd be remiss to take out some of the guys that have just been in it longer and that are embodiment of wrestlers. Whereas The Rock, when he was in it, people knew he was bigger than the sport, and he was and is. But I love that he still comes back to what started it all. And he was a seven-time WWE champion in his own right, part of the Nation of Domination, and
Mm-hmm.
then took off as the People's Champ. And the most charismatic wrestler that I've ever seen, next to Stone Cold, in my opinion. And I would say during that Stone Cold era, he helped launch him into mainstream during the late 90s.
Yeah, I couldn't. I agree with you 100%. Joe, what do you got next on your Mount Rushmore?
So my next is a guy that was my first wrestling hero when I was growing up, and it's still relevant today, and still has made an incredible career post wrestling, even though he is still in it for a short time left, and that is John Cena. Um,
Excellent.
the face that runs the place, Big Match John, attitude adjustment, STF. He had some cool signature moves. Hustle, loyalty, respect. He was the ultimate babyface hero. And it was very controversial. And it's documented in WWE Unreal in a really cool way of his recent turn to heel during his retirement tour, as this is his final few months left as an active WWE champ before he retires at the end of the year. And we're wondering what happens to the belt. So we're still seeing his legacy play out as we speak. Uh, why he's on the Rushmore for me is he carried the torch for almost 2 decades. He was a franchise player during a tricky era for WWE. The post Attitude, I would argue PG era, which became a little bit corny at times for folks like what worked for me as a little kid, but kind of what grew me out of it. He never turned heel through the vast majority of his career, with the exception of the last few months. Um, and he granted hundreds of Make a Wish requests and still came back to put a 5-star match with younger talent. And I think that's why he never turned heel. He did so much outside the ring that they felt would be sacrificed if he took a villainous turn. Um, and then from a career standpoint, he's won 16 WWE championships, tied with Ric Flair for the official record. So I had to put him on just for that alone. And he elevated mid-card talent and put on classic matches weekly. The memories I have of his biggest rivalries was with JBL, Randy Orton, Edge, and CM Punk. That to me defined a generation, specifically Randy Orton. And it was kind of cool that they had one last bash this year after he won the WWE title, which was very nostalgic for someone like me. Randy Orton was the ultimate bad guy for a long time, along with Edge. I remember his first big wins being when he beat Big Show at WrestleMania 20 to win his first singles title. And funny thing people forget too was he was a rapper, part of his early shtick.
Oh yeah.
That gimmick started because he freestyled on a tour bus, and Vince and Stephanie saw that as potential and pitched as part of his character. Because at the time they didn't know what to do with him. He didn't know how long he'd be in this sport. He came out against Kurt Angle with his whole ruthless aggression persona, which just didn't fly with fans. But the rapping is what changed everything. But he doesn't do that now. So people forget that that's what boosted his career. And credit to the man himself, he granted over 650 make-a-wishes, most of any celebrity ever. And he transitioned to Hollywood and is still, I would argue, an A-list movie star at this point with what he's putting out. But unlike The Rock, he stayed connected to WWE much longer. So he's putting out big movies while being the front face of WWE. Whereas The Rock, when he got his first smash, he left and didn't turn back for decades. Um, he's known for burying talent early in his run, but later earned respect for elevating others. But he was my guy. I couldn't not add him just because he dominated the era I watched, and he's still relevant today.
I love this pick, Joe. It's one of those things. It's after my time when Cena becomes a big star. So I know about him, but I didn't like watch him in the ring. But of course, you can't help but ignore, or you can't ignore what he's done. And what I really like about the idea of the ruthless aggression era and the more, like you said, the PG era, is we tend to romanticize the Attitude Era, which was a very short couple of years, really, there in the late '90s, early 2000s. And wrestling fans, especially people that grew up with it, go, "Oh, this was the greatest era of wrestling," and that might be true, but it was very problematic as well. They pushed the envelope so hard because once you begin to do that, when that becomes your business model, you can't ever walk back from it. And in a lot of ways, they pushed it too far in many cases, and that's why I'm happy to see a guy like John Cena become the face of a company that really was treading some waters that they probably shouldn't have been treading, especially at the end. And to see a guy turn that ship around, this giant ship, and to do it with such aplomb. You bring up the fact the Make-A-Wish stuff, and you see it on the Unreal documentary that Netflix is doing with some of these kids, and John Cena is genuinely a good human being. And when it comes to wrestling, you really never know about these guys and girls. You're never really sure who they are because part of it is playing that character, that kayfabe. But with John Cena, everything I see about him, he's just who he is, and he's a genuinely good person, a great human being, and a very talented man. My one last thing I want to say about Cena that you brought up is the fact that to me he was an extremely good athlete, very muscular, very strong. One of those guys that looked the part but could also do it. Pick Big Show up, pick up two guys at a time to do an attitude adjustment. Just incredible feats of strength from a guy like John Cena.
Well, think about all the people we've mentioned so far: Hulk Hogan, Ric
Mm-hmm.
Flair, Stone Cold, Mick Foley. They're not their real names. They're
Right.
walking around as characters, right? They're playing this persona. Whereas John Cena's name is John Cena, and he's walking around as John Cena. So it made it a lot easier, that whole kayfabe, is he just was who he was, and he was athletic, great performer in the process.
Yeah, I love it. I'm going to wrap up my final pick here. I'm going back to the golden era. Now, Hulk Hogan doesn't make my list. And the reason why Hogan doesn't is I loved Hogan in his WWF, early WWF or WWE days. But when he transitioned to the NWO and the Hollywood Hogan and the heel stuff, I always felt he kind of was extending a career that didn't need to be extended, and not all of it was great. There was another guy from that time period that I felt pretty much stayed really great all the way through, and actually was a lot better of a technical actual wrestler in the ring ability, and that's Macho Man Randy Savage.
Mm.
Savage to me is this guy, especially now. Like, I liked him at the time because the way he talked, Hogan and all of that. Oh, yeah, all of that stuff. He put on a great performance on the microphone. He could talk with his insane character that he somehow got over and even did Slim Jim's commercials with. But more so than that was the in ring stuff. The flying elbow is still one of the all time great finishers. You can go back and watch YouTube clips of it right now. You'll be amazed how this thing looks. And this was in a time period where many people were not going off the top rope. The top rope was dangerous in the 70s and the 80s. It's not until the late 90s you see a lot of these high flyers coming out. And Savage was not a little guy. He was a big guy doing a top rope elbow drop as a finisher, but he had great in-ring stuff. I want to bring up one of his matches in particular that changed wrestling, and that's his mid-card match with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat at WrestleMania 3. This match, you can go back and watch it. And what's funny is if you go back and watch it, you'd be like, I don't get it. The reason you don't get it is because that's what wrestling pretty much looks like now. Before that, wrestling was this slow dance. WrestleMania 3, they choreographed every move in that match. They planned all of those false finishes. They did all of that stuff. And Ricky the Dragon Steamboat probably deserves to be on a list as well. One of the all-time. That's what Ric Flair actually said, that was the best in-ring wrestler. So you put Macho Man, you put Steamboat in, you put him at the mid-card of WrestleMania 3, and they put on a match that changed wrestling. And now when you watch Unreal and they talk about spots in the match, the reason they're doing that is that started with that match with Macho Man and Steamboat at WrestleMania 3. It changed how wrestling is done in the ring. And Macho Man had a great career, even moving into WCW in the late 90s, winning a couple titles there late into his career. He transcends as well, makes a couple of movies. Spider-Man, he's in that movie as well. So some of these cases for the Macho Man, but one of my all-time favorites. And he's fun to just go back. I know he dies young. You said it, Joe. These guys don't last long. They put their bodies through all sorts of stuff, and all of the painkillers and things that they take in their career shortens their lives. Steroids as well. But he's got one of those careers that I could go back and watch any of his matches and probably still enjoy all the way through.
Such a fun character. And I'm glad you mentioned WrestleMania 3 because when we think of WrestleMania 3, we don't usually think of Randy Savage and Steamboat. We think of Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan. But anyone that's really watched wrestling would say that's arguably the greatest match of all time. It wasn't the headline of WrestleMania, which, by the way, WrestleMania 3, 30 plus million views at the time,
Oh yeah.
which is more than the Super Bowl was getting. Any show, it was breaking records. It put wrestling at a whole different tier, that wrestling. And that was because the promotion they put behind Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant.
Mm-hmm.
But what people remember most that watched that WrestleMania was that match of Macho Man, Randy Savage, and Steamboat. It's incredible. Recommend anyone that's fascinated by wrestling at all to watch just that match.
Yeah, that's one of those ones that you can throw on and watch the whole thing. It's not super long, couple 10, 15 minutes, but it is solid throughout. And it's the match that really changed wrestling into I know we're a little bit spot heavy these days. What they spots, by the way, is where the high flying maneuvers are the big parts of the show. Those were it. What's funny is you brought up the Andre and the Hulk Hogan match. If you want to watch what wrestling was before that Macho Man Steamboat changed wrestling, that's a good match to look at because it's this very clear slow dance audience participation, whereas wrestling then becomes more about the technical in-ring ability moving forward.
Yeah, my memory of Macho Man is hearing and then finding out about that match. I obviously didn't grow up with it. Understanding the whole Miss Elizabeth shtick, which was
Oh
very,
yeah.
very interesting at the time when you had quote unquote managers and romantic interests. That was the early era of that. And they had a real relationship outside the ring, which you don't always see in some of these paired couples. And I also think of Spider Man
Of
when I
course.
think of him. That's what I grew up on, the real Macho Man in the ring.
Bone saw. All right,
Yeah.
Joe, you got one more, right? So
I'm going to end with the guy that started the Mount Rushmore discussion today. I feel like I just can't exclude him from any list, and that's Hulk Hogan. Rest in peace.
Of
The
course.
Immortal, the Hulkster, known for the leg drop. What you gonna do, brother? Hulk Hogan was professional wrestling in the 1980s, and without a question, he wrestling would not be where it is now without Hulk Hogan. Um, Vince McMahon Jr., when he nationalized wrestling, he chose the Hulk. He plucked him and said he is going to be the face of this franchise. He's going to hold the mantle, and you can't tell the story of wrestling. It can't be told without Hulk Hogan. He brought the business from Smoky Halls to stadiums. There'd probably be no WrestleMania without Hogan. No rockin' wrestling era, no mainstream explosion of wrestling into pop culture. I even think about his appearance on Rocky 3, which got him in a lot of trouble at the time when he played Thunderlips.
Oh yeah.
Vince McMahon did not want him to do that. He did it anyway. Um, WrestleMania 1, which was in 1985, he teamed Mr. T, some may remember, in the main event. And that helped launch WrestleMania as a brand. And then WrestleMania 3, which we just talked about with Macho Man, is arguably the biggest WrestleMania of all time, wherein he slammed 520-pound Andre the Giant in front of 93,000 fans at the Pontiac Silverdome. And then the other big memory I have of him is when he turned heel in WCW, which shocked the world. I mean, this was the ultimate babyface, to your point earlier, take your vitamins. He was a great role model. He got into a lick of controversy when the whole steroid scandals were coming out, him being the face of that. He took a break from wrestling and became kind of attempted to be the early era of The Rock, John Cena type with movies and TV. But I think he realized early on it wasn't for him. He was doing a TV show, but he missed wrestling. And Eric Bischoff and WCW came calling, and he came. And he played the babyface Hulk, but just wasn't working. And when he came out and turned heel with NWO with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, it was massive. He reinvented himself as a new character, the Hollywood Hogan. I remember a lot trimmer at the time. He had the black
Mm-hmm.
5 o'clock shadow with the still gold Fu Manchu. And he launched the Monday Night Wars and continued to be in all facets of wrestling throughout the rest of his life. 12-time world champion, WWF, WWE, WCW. He made appearances on TNA, indie circuits. He loved wrestling more than anyone. And although he could have been a maybe movie star, it just wasn't in the cards for him. Couple fun facts about him. I don't know if you remember, he had a Saturday morning cartoon, Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling. And then I remember his entrance, the Real American. It
Real American, yeah.
became more of a patriotic anthem. I thought we might start singing it at ball games. And he was the first wrestler to be inducted twice into the WWE Hall of Fame. Once solo in 2005 and again with NWO in 2020.
Hulk Hogan is a monument to himself. When we talk about these Mount Rushmores and you're putting people on the list, you're absolutely right, Joe. Like we don't have this conversation right now if Hulk Hogan never did what he did. He created the modern view of wrestling, and everything that's come out since then is derivative of, right? Like this big, larger than life star that had his own stuff, his own endorsement. His Hulkamania was bigger than WrestleMania. If you don't have WrestleMania without Hulkamania, like you were saying. And so like he's a guy that absolutely is a consensus the dude when it comes to pro wrestling. And there seems to be, and I guess I'm just going to talk on this for just a moment because there's definitely been, at least what I've seen on a lot of the social media and a lot of the news reports and stuff, is this backlash after his death, where as Ozzy Osbourne gets this outpouring of love and support from people after he dies, you almost see some of the opposite towards Hogan and some of the things that he had said and some of the career choices that he had made outside of the ring. That's a really bad way of looking at history, right? Is to boil down somebody's worst moments and say, well, this is why they're no good. and ignoring all of the amazing, unbelievable things that they did accomplish. Bottom line, I watched Hulk Hogan in the 1980s. I saw him on Saturday Night's Main Event. I watched those WrestleManias. I grew up with this guy telling me to take my vitamins and drink my milk. And there were other wrestlers, but he was wrestling. He defined what wrestling was, could be, and is to this day. And I think that there's this unfortunate side effect where people tend to look at something and they go, oh yeah, but he did this or he did that, and that makes him a bad human. And in those cases, we should ignore all of the other things. I think that we have to understand there's a dichotomy to everything. First of all, don't ever meet your heroes. By the way, you're always going to be let down. Everybody is flawed. Okay. Everybody, every single person in the universe is flawed. To understand that dichotomy of humanity, right? People can be the greatest professional wrestler of all time, and they can also be potentially horrible human beings. But that doesn't erase the first part of that argument.
Yeah. And to your point, he's a human being, right? And most things humans do are forgivable. We learn, we make mistakes, not justifying any actions that you maybe disagree with that he's done publicly in his life. But with the asterisks of, murdering somebody or selling heroin to children, most things are forgivable. And I think as time goes on with his legacy now being deceased, we'll remember him more for his highlights than his lowlights and the moments that carry the sport today that people love and will always remember him for.
No, and that's the way it should be, Joe. And I know we're probably in a moment right now where we're going to adjust, and eventually it's like a cult classic, and eventually we'll get to the point where people are going to respect and go, oh yeah, of course Hulk Hogan was the guy. It's a set. I That was a tough one, man. I mean, certainly losing Ozzy was a big one, but I knew Ozzy was on the way out. He did his farewell show. He'd been unhealthy for quite some time. Hogan, to me, was a shock and a surprise. He was doing the Real American Beer thing. He had just had this new promotion that he was kind of pushing off. And then he passes away. And all of a sudden, part of my childhood is gone forever. And there's part of me that is genuinely sad about that. This is a great
Well,
pick, Joe. Absolutely
some would
deserved.
argue you're not dead until you're forgotten, and he
There you
won't be
go.
forgotten.
Legacy lives on, right? And that's what real history is.
Yeah. And one thing I like to just close with is wrestling has always been more than just choreographed moves, right? It's characters, it's stories, it's moments burned into our brain forever as we're talking about all the nostalgia this has brought us. Hogan may be gone, but what he's built is still climbing the top rope, and long live the legends we mentioned and the new ones to come.
Well, that's going to do it up for us, man. That is our picks. The real question is, though, is what would you carve onto your mountain? Until the next episode, he's Joe Mintz. I'm Mike Mintz, and this is the Mount Rushmore Show.